Hello, and welcome to the Heathen's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Siri Vincent Plough, and I'm so glad you're here. This is the show where I explore heathenry through a queer lens. We will be talking about traditional witchcraft, runes, folklore, and so much more. Join us, won't you, as we journey to the ends of the 9 realms and back. Well, hello! It has been so long since I have recorded an episode of the Heathen's Journey podcast. Lots of things are happening right now. I've been teaching with the Fellowship of Fire and Ice. I've been hosting creative co-working sessions on my Patreon, and I'm opening up the Queering the Runes online course for ongoing registration. So if you read my book and wanted to dive in even deeper, check out the course. Link will, of course, be in the show notes. Again, I'm sorry it's been so long since I was a regular podcaster in the Heathen's Journey podcast. My urge as someone who was raised female is always to apologize for how long it's been since I was an active podcaster here, but honestly, I've been living life under ever-increasing levels of fascism in the United States. That is already more than enough reason not to be as on top of everything as usual. And then on top of that, I needed to take time away from this podcast in order to figure out what the heck it is that I really want to talk about here. I've been expanding my practice within heathenry, going deeper into my own spiritual practices, and I've also been expanding my practices outside of heathenry as well. I've been exploring chaos magic even more than I already had been practicing it. I actually launched a second podcast with my longtime collaborator and best witch, Cassandra Snow. The podcast is called Chaos and Cunning, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. All of our transcripts are available for free on the Chaos and Cunning Patreon. I definitely encourage you to listen to that podcast as well if you're particularly interested in exploring different topics around magic and different magical techniques. So this year has really been about getting back into podcasting. And that has meant I've been thinking with fondness about the Heathen's Journey podcast, and I finally figured out how I wanted to shift things here. I want to continue with each season having a theme, but more on that later. I don't want to get too meta too early. So today I want to revisit some of the themes of this podcast that will endure as long as I am making it, and that is how we build community-sustaining practices in the midst of oppression and fascism. And even since the first episode of this podcast aired in 2020, as little as 5 years ago, wow, the landscape has shifted greatly. If you go all the way back to the beginning of the podcast, you'll see that one of the first episodes was about fascism within heathenry and how we can fight back. Unfortunately, this question has continued to be even more important, and I want to return to this subject again. I need to resituate this within the present contemporary of this podcast. I need to resituate us within the present moment. At the time of recording, we're in Trump's second administration. Cities across the country have faced brutal occupations by ICE, tearing families apart and trying to intimidate us into lying down and letting this administration run away with our rights. The streets from LA to New York to Chicago to my own beloved Minneapolis have been overtaken. I'm not going to lie, I started this administration in a place of deep fear and panic. I was living in that nervous system state of fight or flight, but mostly in the space of flight. Like so many other queer and trans people in the United States, I was just waiting for the administration to come for me. But when ICE came to the Twin Cities metro region, I saw how many people were coming together to say, absolutely not. Networks popped up in neighborhoods across the city, seemingly overnight. Of course, I know that this was not an overnight effort. This is the result of decades of organizing on the part of BIPOC, queer folks, and allies time dedicated to creating the infrastructure that could be activated. We were primed to resist fascism in these cities because so many people here were doing the ground. We were primed to resist fascism in these cities because so many people here were doing on-the-ground organizing and educating, tirelessly working towards justice in a system that is built to provide justice only to a limited few. The ICE occupation that we've already lived through didn't target queer folks, but I know that when they do come for us, there's a community ready to rise up. As a heathen, community protection and support is very important. Mutual aid is not a new concept within heathenry. It is old, it has roots well before the stanzas on gift-giving in the sayings of the High One, and the literary tradition shows over and over again how important community cohesion and collaboration were within their worldview. This is something that we have definitely lost, especially as predominantly white pagan tradition. Whiteness absorbs and flattens community identity. Contemporary Americans, and to a certain extent contemporary American, and to a certain extent European, culture prioritizes first the individual, then the nuclear family, and only secondarily the wider community. Cultural studies way. Because we as a culture have embraced these ideals of individuality, we create unspoken norms and systems that prioritize individuality over community care. Because it's cultural, it's something that we all participate in to some extent. It's easier to control the masses when they don't realize they're the masses. When people are thinking only of their limited experience and individuality, it's harder to organize together. This myth of individuality is also supported by cultural systems of Christian majority. And this is where some of the more insidious recruitment happens. Something that I think over and over again as I watch these events unfold is that it's absolutely absurd that Republicans and the far right don't think what they're doing is evil. But when that evil is introduced slowly over time, it becomes a boiling frog scenario, where the conservative values seep in slowly, like water heating up, until it's too late and the frog gets boiled. Even since I started this podcast 5 short years ago, I feel how much more the United States has swung toward majority Christian ideals. Now, if I go to a big department store, I notice that there are little gold necklaces with Christian sayings on them and so many different varieties of delicate crosses. I went to a Books-A-Million and got stuck in an entire section dedicated to Bible journals and Bible covers. Of course, none of this is in and of itself wrong. I think that everyone should have access to materials that support their faith. And sometimes, like in the case of Books-A-Million, there are other religions represented. But in other cases, like at Target, other religions and religious paraphernalia aren't represented. But it seems like I see them so much more often than I used to. I see them in these spaces that are intended to be almost blank spaces that are average, everyday, normal, and it's normal that people go here. I know that there has to be some kind of theoretical term for this, maybe in urban studies or something, but it's not third space. It's just kind of like spaces that are considered normal in the overculture, like the grocery store, like just these super average spaces that we don't think about very often. I always assumed that separation of church and state meant that places that weren't explicitly spiritual wouldn't carry these kinds of items. Then again, it feels like the creep of more religious iconography into these spaces that are meant to be neutral reflects a broader American push toward Christian hegemony. Being explicitly and visibly pagan right now feels like it means more than it used to. Before starting my very public career as a witch, my mom was more worried about what my extended family would think of my spirituality than that I was queer. Thankfully, my family continues to accept me even if they vote against my rights. Which, is that really acceptance? A conversation for another time. Over the last 10 years or so, we've seen the rise of the trad wife as a performance of traditional gender roles and the ideal Christian woman. And yes, while there may be trad wives who aren't Christian, the culture reads as incredibly Christian. And the trad wife is particularly insidious because on the surface, it looks peaceful. And peace is something that we so desperately want. Here are some things about the trad wife lifestyle that I know a lot of people are drawn to regardless of their political affiliation. Feminine fashion. Not quite high femme in the queer way, but being seen as embracing femininity. And honestly, the clothes can be really nice sometimes. Those sundresses work. I love it. Living in a beautiful landscape away from the pollution and noise of the city. Oh. Here are some things about trad wife lifestyle that I know a lot of people are drawn to. 1, feminine fashion. Not quite high femme, as in queer femme, but being seen as embracing femininity. And honestly, sometimes those sundresses are really cute. 2, living in a beautiful landscape away from the pollution and noise of the city. And we can talk a lot more about how cities are racialized later. 3, having the time to make food from scratch. 4, being able to spend time with your children. 5, trad wife imagery really sells this idea of health and wellness that is also very insidious. There's a reason so many trad wives go maha, and there's a reason it's called the crunchy to alt-right pipeline. And 6, a sense of history. Even though the history that is presented by the trad wife is imagined. When you're working 60-plus hour work weeks, barely making ends meet, eating frozen meals or scrounging leftovers at work, terrified that your job will be taken over by AI, paying high bills for childcare, of course this lifestyle might sound appealing. It might even sound like a vacation, a way for your nervous system to get caught up on all the things that you haven't had time to do because you've been stuck as a cog in the late-stage capitalist machine. But the trad wife lifestyle isn't just about slowing down, having soft feminine moments, being there for your family. It also comes with a Christian ideal of heteropatriarchy. If you want to have these things, you shouldn't have to give up your rights to do so. This is why I think it's really important to be visibly pagan right now. A lot of the romanticism that pagans participate in is some of the same back to the earth, slowing down, depth relationships sort of thing. You can have this and not give up your rights. I will repeat that. You can do these things and not give up your rights. That is, of course, not to say that paganism is without weird reactionary patriarchal assholes, but the culture within paganism is different. Paganism isn't a majority culture, and our existence in this time is an alternative. You can be interested in land connectedness, slowing down, honoring femininity and masculinity and every kind of gender expression without being a trad wife or buying into this cultural romance. It's that sense of peace that is really important here. I really do think that is a lot of what the conservative influencers are trying to sell. Here, of course, I'm thinking specifically about accounts like Ballerina Farm, but also other, quote, soft girl content that slides into conservative ideals without the viewer fully realizing it. These are all selling this idea of simplicity and peace, which is honestly very appealing in these difficult times. But we can make peaceful lives that go against the grind culture without buying into these dangerous gender norms. That's actually where I think paganism can be very helpful. And within heathenry specifically, the concept of Frith can help us. So Frith, which we'll be talking about more in the next interview episode, doesn't really have an easy English equivalent, but it means something akin to a peace forged through connections with folks you can trust. Frith is a complicated concept that has many different layers of meaning, and so I don't want to leave it at simply peace. It was one of the ways in which communities were tied together, and it is a critical worldview for conflict resolution and determining justice in a situation. While many communities have ways of managing these things, the way that Frith has articulated is deeply woven into the fabric of heathen culture. Reverend Maire Durkan urges us to understand Frith as a dynamic relationship rooted in respect and care. According to Winifred Hodge Rose, heathen elder and teacher, there are 4 different levels of Frith: kinship bonds, loyalty among leaders and groups, peace within sacred space, and the peace that arises from shared ideals, like animism or human rights. Reverend Maire Durkan places Frith in the concept of reciprocity and mutual aid, writing that, quote, "Reciprocity teaches us that families flourish when gifts, such as emotional support, resources, or simply listening, are exchanged openly across generations without conditions," end quote. It is the reciprocity here that helps us to draw firmer boundaries with community members. Through the development of Frith, we can better understand when someone crosses a boundary and violates Frith. One of the interesting things about this concept is that it works really well with what sociologists refer to as the paradox of inclusion. The paradox is thus: in order to have truly inclusive communities, those communities must have boundaries. Creating inclusive, diverse communities means excluding people who seek to harm members of the community. In other words, building a community around Frith, shared ideals of peace, reciprocity, and radical hospitality means that by necessity, those who don't adhere to these ideals can be removed from the community. It's important that the bounds of inclusion don't close around religion. Frith is built outside of dogma. It is actively woven between community members, a living and breathing thing that can adapt when faced with new information. According to these values of radical hospitality, anyone can enter or be a member of a community unless and until they have begun to harm others through discriminatory practices, physical and psychological violence, and other wrongdoing. This categorically makes the community, which purports to be welcoming, not a safe space anymore. It creates a disconnect between the agreed-upon values of the community and the lived reality of that community. And this is precisely why Frith is such a helpful concept for building welcoming communities. Frith lays out what is accepted always versus what is accepted on a case-by-case basis. Frith is an intricate process of creating peace through constant negotiation with not only your own needs, but the needs of the community. Through defining what this peace is, we're more able to actually create peaceful communities. And I'll actually be talking about a lot of these concepts next episode when I have on my first guest of the season, Reverend Maire Durkan. We will be discussing her book, Frigg's Twelvefold Flame, Creating Justice and Healing with the Goddess and Her Court, as well as other concepts related to inclusive heathenry. So tune back in a couple of weeks. So on the one hand, we have fascist communities that impose will upon citizens and tighten behavior from the top down. And then we have communities built around Frith that are in constant process of creating welcoming spaces. One is a negotiation, the other is an order. I think that learning about many different ways of looking at the world is actually a really important practice right now. Reminding ourselves that there is strong diversity in the world and that our opinion isn't the only one, that there are many ways of being and that doesn't make others wrong, is essential. And while we do this, it's important to question your own beliefs. I overthink about this all the time. Is what I believe what I really believe or what I've been told to believe from a young age? And what if I was a different person with a different background? Which brings me to the theme of this season, expanding the horizons of heathenry. One of the ways that we fight white supremacy and xenophobia within heathenry is through expanding what it means to be a heathen. There's a stereotypical picture of the heathen, and here on this podcast, I have never wanted to box us in to what it means to practice in this way. So throughout the season, I'll be exploring new facets of heathenry that I'm exploring in my own practice, as well as hosting guests who are heathens that don't often get the spotlight. We'll be discussing interfaith efforts and dual faithism and magic. We'll be exploring how heathens interact with other members of the magical and pagan communities.
This is also for my benefit. I've never only been a heathen, and I wanted to be able to explore other aspects of my folk magic practice. So join me, won't you, for an exciting new season of the Heathen's Journey podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Heathen's Journey podcast. I'm so glad that you could be here. If you are interested in supporting the podcast financially, I would recommend checking out my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Siri Vincent Pluff. And of course, that is linked in the show notes. Until next time, stay weird.